So once you decide on your questions, right? Once you decide on your questions, you then decide your population and you sample, your sampling strategy and your sample. You wanna design, or you wanna figure out what you wanna give to your sample, right? To get the data. So this is where instruments come in. So instrument is a broad term. In psychology and education research, instruments are the tools for collecting data. That's it, yeah, it's just tools. They go by different names because they look at slightly different things. So they might be called inventories or questionnaires or rating scales or tests. Surveys, obviously, just a general term. Some are called indicators. So these are sort of different types of tools that you can use in survey research. So instruments try to collect data, right? But I mean, if you do it rigorously, you don't just collect data. You collect data that's relevant, and is relevant to a construct. Yeah. So a construct is a hypothesized concept. When you talk to psychologists, they always bring this thing up, construct. So what's construct, right? So it's a hypothesized concept. For example, self-efficacy, that's supposed to explain behavior, right? For example, personality will be a construct. What else? Intelligence, yeah? All these are really relevant examples in the field of education, yeah? In fact, TPAC, I mean, it's also considered a construct. It's a framework with multiple constructs. When you have this construct, hypothesized construct, and you have a variable that you define, for example, if you have self-efficacy as a construct, you have a variable saying, if I work hard, I think I can go to the university or polytechnic, and you give it to the student, you then collect data. This is how you operationalize the construct and collect the data. So this is sort of the sort of more formal way of thinking about instruments, right? So it's not just me, just coming up with a bunch of questions, just asking people to respond. You have to think a bit about what is it that you want to measure, and typically, or what is it that you want to collect data for? Typically, you're trying to collect data for a construct, and a concept that you want to test or ask about. So this is where instruments play a role, right? You define the variable, and then you collect the data. So this part is supposed to reveal something about this construct. All right. So how do you get the data? You get data by having items, which are typically questions or statements and so on. So there's one type of item called structured. It's fixed selection of responses. It's very easy to score. For example, I like to use problem-based learning in a classroom. You then ask the student or respondent to decide whether they agree, strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and so on. So there's a structure. Yeah. You don't give any possibility to go astray. Like ask a question or ask them to rate, and then give them the answers, and they're supposed to select. So unstructured would be open-ended questions. Yeah. With no predetermined responses. These are typically harder, more time-consuming to score. So questions or items like, how do you feel about problem-based learning in a classroom? And then you're supposed to write the answers. Because many of you might already be familiar with this or have some notion about this, I'm going to focus a bit more on this part. In fact, this is used a lot more in research, in education. Or maybe not, but at least in my own background, structured items are a lot more familiar. So I've been talking about TPAC a lot, right? TPAC, yeah. So these are the actual, in fact, some of you may have participated in some of these surveys, yeah, testing your competencies or whatever, or perceptions. So this is a TPAC instrument, and these are some of the questions. For example, number 2, item 2, I can use technology to determine students' needs related to content area in the teaching process. So the respondent, in this case, a teacher, would then respond strongly disagree, disagree, neither agree, or strongly agree. So this has been an example type of structured item, and this kind of item has a special name, agree, disagree scale. It's called Likert scale. You might have heard of it. It's named after a person. It's used a lot. I'm sure you've seen this, but just bear in mind there are other types of instruments, right? Other types of items. I brought this up because I think you may have certain questions, like, for example, why use 7-point or 5-point? Like, why some other number? So based on research, about 50 or 60 years of research, it seems that more points seem to be better. We haven't spoken about reliability, but there are diminishing returns, So people typically don't ask you to fill out a survey with 15 options, for example, 15 points. Typically, it's between 5 and 7. All right, how about odd versus even? When I was at psychology undergrad, again, doing all these things, right? Like, why do you use even? Why do you use odd? There's no clear answer. There's some hints that if you use odd, respondents might gravitate a bit more toward the center, neutral, and all that. So you want to sort of split them up, right? Like you want to force them to decide. But it's kind of controversial. You may want to refer to more formal textbooks if you're really interested in doing survey research and doing Likert scales. They call it Likert scales. So these are some of the practical issues to deal with. I'm going to move on to item construction. So if you come up with your own Likert scale, right, you want to ask questions, you want to create these items to test certain constructs, for example, like I said earlier, certain concepts, and then you want to construct the item. So these are practical advice. So you have to clearly word them. Poor one would be, why are there so many typos? I have volitional power over my own vocation. I don't know who writes like that. I did. But better one would be, I control my career choices, right? The shorter, the better. Yeah? Avoid double-barrel items. For example, I believe that all students have the capacity to learn and behave respectfully in class. These are typically two different concepts, right? Like capacity to learn and behave respectfully. Ideally you want to separate them, right? So split them into two items. Avoid leading questions. So for example, there are a lot of teachers in the room. How many times a week do you enjoy communicating with parents? You don't want to have all these loaded words in there that lead people or make assumptions, right? Better one would be, how many times a week do you communicate with parents? That's it. If you want to ask them whether they like communicating with parents, you want to have a second item, right? Like, do you enjoy, or do you have a Likert, I enjoy communicating with parents? And then you have Likert scale, or you can ask, do you enjoy communicating with parents? Yes or no? So these are some of the things you want to bear in mind. Some other pointers, avoid items that are ambiguous, wordy, some examples earlier, disrespectful, irrelevant, jargons. So jargons, try not to use jargons. If you do use jargons, either explain it or avoid them completely. So some more pointers. The first few questions should be easy, straightforward, or neutral. This because you don't want to turn them off, right? Like, I mean, if the first question is something like is so difficult to decipher, is loaded and so on, it's going to be tough for them to continue. Sensitive or difficult questions should be in the middle or later section, so same thing as well. Clear and uncluttered layout. Questionnaire shouldn't be too long. I had a professor who dumped me a 50-page survey that I had to fill up. But the good thing is that he paid $50. So, so I did it anyway. But for the life of me, I didn't know why he would do something like that. I think he was probably trying to get a lot a lot of different things in there. So try not to do that. Yeah. And the last $50 maybe. Yeah. Dollar a page. Yeah. He's actually one of the really authoritative psychometricians in Singapore. He's a very senior. He's a full professor somewhere, but back then I didn't really think too much. Try not to have it too long. Yeah, shorter the better. But it's a rule of thumb, 30 minutes. But you may want to figure it out yourself. This part is, I think, the key point here. Right? Perform pilot testing. Yeah, so even the best of instruments can fail. That is why you wanna pilot test it, right? So this will be to look at whether questions are difficult to understand and not giving you the kind of interpretation that you expect. You think there's only one way to interpret it. In fact, this exercise is a good exercise. I thought there was only one way to interpret a particular description, but it looks like a few were potentially applicable to both. So you want to pilot test it in small groups. Obviously, you don't want to do it in hundreds or thousands, but try your best to pilot test it. Give it to your friends or colleagues or whatever. All right. Now you have your instrument, right? In the field of psychometrics. So I use the term a lot, psychometrics. This is the formal field that deals with instruments, yeah, collecting data and describing populations and so on. There are two important things: validity and reliability of instruments. So I'm going to go through each one. So validity. What's validity? You just have to remember one word: accuracy. How accurately does it measure what it is intended to measure? So if you have a construct, for example, in construct validity, you have a construct of stress. To what extent does the instrument measure the construct of stress? I give you an example of stress versus stress coping. Do you see the difference between the two? Stress and stress coping. Yeah, you can think of stress as perceptions of how much stress someone has, or actual stress. You could also measure the amount of stress hormones they have. And stress coping is how you cope, yeah. So these two might be related, but they can actually be separable and different constructs. So there's construct validity, how accurately you measure the construct. There's also content validity. So for example, if you want to study stress, there might be different facets, right? Different aspects of stress. So to what extent does the instrument represent all facets or aspects of a construct? So stress, you can think of it as acute stress versus chronic stress. So these will be two different aspects. You can also think of it in other dimensions. For example, like physical stress versus more like mental stress. I'm not a stress expert, but it is that there might be multiple dimensions, multiple aspects. Last one would be criterion validity. How well does the instrument correlate with another instrument? So the criterion part is the other instrument or a behavior. So for example, if you have you develop a new stress inventory or stress instrument, you want to ask how well does my instrument correlate with someone else's instrument that's been used for 20 years, for example, yeah? So that's criterion validity. So the key word here is accuracy. How accurately does it do all this? Now the other thing is reliability. An instrument or survey or inventory and so on, ideally has to have reliability. So reliability is how consistently the instrument measures something, right? So you have test, retest, reliability. So you come up with a stress inventory, teacher stress, for example. It's a very hot topic. You want to give the same teacher, say Roger, right? You give Roger the instrument, and then 3 months later, you give Roger the exact same instrument, and then see how well it correlates, yeah? there's test retest. So it's pretty self-explanatory, explanatory test and then retest. Equivalence is when you give someone the survey or instrument, but you give it two different versions. So you may have a bank of 100 items, right? In one version, you take 50 items. The other version, you take the other 50. Yeah, so you then correlate. There's also internal consistency, and I'll get to it. And then inter-rater reliability. So this is the part that's probably relevant to you guys as well. If you interview someone and then you interpret their perceptions and so on, you want to have another rater do the same thing and see how well you agree. So this is sort of how consistent the different raters are. So this is an example of reliability, Cronbach's alpha. You will hear this a lot, yeah. I mean, I'm putting up the formula there in case you want to reference it, but it's not that difficult. Actually, it just means how well the variance in the individual items. So for example, you have a teacher stress inventory, right, with 10 items. How much of the variance in each item across subjects, right? So if you have 10 subjects, how much of the variance would sum up and be compared to the variance of the total score. So if you have 10 items, you can just sum up all the scores for each individual, and then you get there and you find the variance. So this, in general, the higher it is, the more reliable the instrument. So typically, reliability goes from 0 to 1. In fact, I would say formally it goes 0 to 1. Doesn't go beyond 1. And this is an example. Again, this group of researchers in Singapore validated the consistency. For example, internal reliability of this survey was established with high Cronbach's alpha of 0.8. So whenever you see this, right, just keep in mind what it means is that you have the different items and they correlate so well that they are measuring in a consistent way, right? So it's very consistent. If you have Cronbach's alpha of 0.4 or 0.3, which is pretty low, it means it's very inconsistent. You know, some items, the respondents might score it very high. Some items, they might score it very low. They might give an answer that's very different, but they're supposed to measure the same construct, right? But if they're not measuring it reliably, that means it's not a good instrument. All right. So what's a good number? I think that's probably what you guys are interested in. Like, okay, so the best advice I can give is the higher the better. Again, I don't think there's a clear-cut definition. 0.8 typically is something that's considered good or above. So, all right. So another practical advice is instrument development is not easy. You shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel. Ideally, you want to use what you've learned from last week, you know, literature review and so on, to find out the instrument you can use. This is one really good database called EBSCO or EBSCOhost. I'm going to give a very quick tour, 1-minute tour. It's a database of, according to them, a database of all instruments in the English-speaking world. I actually doubt that, but that's what they claim. Another example, let's say you are interested in teacher stress, right? So there are a few inventories here, index of teaching stress or teacher stress inventory. Let's just click on this. It's going to tell you what it measures. Yeah, degree of occupational stress experienced by teachers. And then it's going to tell you how high it is and so on. But it's going to give you some psychometric properties. For example, the whole scale alpha reliability for the combined sample, they had some sample, was 0.93. So that's a pretty high reliability is a pretty good instrument, and then they give you more descriptions and so on. So this is one database, if you want, you can use to try to look for instruments. Yeah, creativity or critical thinking will be a good one. What else? Let's say language development or something. Test of expressive language, for example. Yeah, this is something relevant for me because I have children and they have problems with expressive language. What's the other construct associated with language? There's expressive language, and then there's you understanding. There's receptive language, right? So this one deals with expression, right? Expression. So it's very important to differentiate these different constructs. So it gives you descriptions, correlations between first and second test administration, 0.72 to 0.91. What is this reliability? Do you remember? What is this called? Correlations between first and second tests. Test, retest. So this is test, retest, reliability. So this is not Cronbach's alpha, it's test, retest when you give the same children, the test twice. Okay. All right. So in terms of the instruments, if you have to develop it well. If you don't need to develop it, find the right instruments and with the right properties, accuracy and validity, reliability, and so on. So, any questions?